Welcome to Dynamic Leadership Center first session in this ongoing working series for small business and medium-sized business owners and leaders who are ready to build innovation into the DNA of their organizations. Intentionally, sustainably, and profitably. Now, if you're here, you likely are no stranger to the pressure to innovate. It shows up in all kinds of ways. A new technology hits the market and you feel pressure to adopt it, or risk falling behind. A competitor shifts their strategy and suddenly your current model feels exposed. Or your internal systems start buckling under growth and you're forced to rework the engine while flying the airplane. But in the rush to adapt, a surprising thing happens. Many smart leaders begin to make worse decisions, not better ones, not because they lack vision or work ethic, but because under pressure, we all tend to rely on cognitive shortcuts. Neuroscience calls them heuristics. You may think of them as cognitive biases, which is a form of heuristics. In business, they often show up as overconfidence, planning fallacy, confirmation bias, or blind spots around how change actually works. That's where this series begins. By creating a space to slow the thinking down long enough to upgrade the thinking itself. Just like in automobile racing, the champions consciously choose where they need to go slow so they can go fast where it really matters. Why now? This is a working series for real leaders with real businesses solving real challenges in real time. The intention is to create momentum, not noise, simplicity on the other side of complexity. The goal is to give you frameworks and tools to lead innovation with clarity and confidence and avoid the avoidable mistakes. They cost time, trust, and talent, and they can often lead to much worse. Each session will include live illustrations, decision tools, and real-world examples. No theory without application, no ideas without action. The bigger possibility, why 10x is within reach. Let's begin with a radical idea. 10x growth isn't only possible, it's available to many businesses who learn to lead differently. Now here's a mental model to consider. Imagine a professional sports team preparing for a big game. Only when the game starts, they realize there's no opponent on the field. They can score at will, run their plays without resistance, maximize their potential. Imagine what that score would be. In many ways, that's what it's like to run a business today. Yes, you have competitors, and there's the environment you have to deal with, the external factors, but most companies aren't losing because of a direct external threat like an opponent. They're losing to internal complexity, to silos, to misalignment, to repeating old patterns, to leadership that doesn't realize when it's getting in its own way. So what happens when you stop acting like you're under attack and start leading like you're playing with open field ahead? You begin to leverage your brand, your people, your processes, your hard-won trust. You leverage your resourcefulness, your own and that of your leaders. And you leverage your ability to create synergy, where small shifts compound into exponential impact. The real constraint isn't the market. It's often the mindset of the people making the decisions, which brings us to three key distinctions. One, not all innovation is created equal. A big trap is when leaders treat all innovation as the same, but there are actually three very different kinds. Business model innovation, changes to how you make money. Operating model innovation, changes to your business internally and how it delivers value. And process innovation, fine-tunes the way that work gets done at the tactical level. Now, each one of these requires a different kind of investment, a different kind of risk, and most importantly, a different kind of leadership role from you, the owner or the senior leader. If you mistake a business model shift for a simple process change, you'll under-resource it. If you treat a process upgrade like strategic innovation, you'll overcomplicate it. That's how leaders get blindsided, not by competition, but by misunderstanding the change that they've unleashed. Now, your role must change as the business changes. The second distinction is personal. From problem solver to pattern spotter, from driver to enabler. And here's the key. You can't delegate this transition. When a company is navigating change, it doesn't just need someone to tell people what's happening. It needs a leader who can hold the tension that's between what is and what's possible. In future segments, I'll talk about the difference between project management and project leadership, how to know when to stay close and when to hand it off, how to spot when your leaders are accidentally diminishing their teams by holding too much, too tightly, for too long. I covered some of this in the previous series on leadership development plans, and we'll revisit that methodology as it applies when we're going through this innovation series. The third one is change management. Change management is not optional, and it is measurable. This third distinction is where most execution fails. Change doesn't fail because people are lazy or resistant. It fails because we skip the part where people's thinking has to change before their behavior can. You may have heard the phrase that a great plan with mediocre implementation will produce less results than a mediocre plan with great execution. No plan survives contact with reality. So it's not just about the plan. It's about how we execute, and how we execute has to do with change management. When we introduce innovation, we're not just changing the tools or the flowchart. We're asking people to rebuild mental models, to think differently, prioritize differently, and that's hard. Without a clear path, most people default to what they know. In this series, we'll walk through how to measure your organization's readiness for change, how to spot the hidden habit-based patterns that derail execution, and how to build and evolve simple KPIs that reflect real transformation, not just cosmetic progress. You can't afford to confuse movement with momentum or noise with results. A simple example, technology as the unintended Trojan horse. This may resonate with you. I'll give you a quick example that I've watched create major problems. You find a powerful new application, software, hardware, some technology. The demonstration and presentation is impressive. The pitch is airtight. You're sold, but here's the trap. Instead of defining how the technology should serve your strategy, vision, purpose, you let it redefine your team's process. This is unintentional. It happens unknowingly, which is why I call it the Trojan horse, often at the expense of your long-term goals. You adapt to the tool instead of adapting the tool to serve your vision. That's not innovation, that's compromise. And more often than not, you pay for the privilege of reworking your own strengths. It's easy to confuse new with better or change with progress, speed with success. As you think about innovation in your organization and where it begins in a practical sense, it's worth asking one final question. Why does this matter now? We're living in a time of shifting global influence, what Ray Dalio calls a changing world order. You should check out that book. I think it's a fascinating read, and it's a real eye-opener, and it provides a nice backdrop. While we don't know exactly how or when or even if the balance of power will shift, we do know this. Countries poised to gain will push hard. Those with the most to lose will defend their ground, sometimes at the edge of what's ethical, sometimes with short-sighted, reactive moves that do more harm than good. This isn't to create fear. It's context for awareness. Strategy today means understanding how global tension reshapes local markets, customer behavior, and what it takes to lead with clarity and integrity through ambiguity. What's powerful about using the changing world order as a strategic frame is that it gives you something rare, a stable, long cycle narrative to guide your decision making, near term and long term. It doesn't matter what's happening day to day. The long arcs of history don't pivot on headlines. Like a cruise ship turning in open water, the changes are slow but very visible, if you're watching. The 2008 financial crisis, for instance, followed a nearly identical demographic pattern to what Japan experienced a decade earlier. In both cases, the largest segment of the population hit an age where spending slows down and in turn growth reverses. That was big, but the global reordering underway today dwarfs those events, and it will shape the rules of competition for decades to come. Now, I'll start with an illustration that we've all experienced, and I'll apply it to what is directly in front of us. I like to use frameworks and models to help guide thinking because it's too easy to fall into cognitive traps that follow us around. Now, this illustration looks at the difference between change that's grounded in reality versus change that is potential in the field of infinite possibilities. I like to use frameworks, as I said, and models, things that we can talk about. It provides a common language. And, as much as it feels like science, there's a lot of art. And that's the beauty of it, because as leaders, we have to be flexible. Hence the term dynamic leadership. It's very fluid. But having a framework from which to start and having a common language across your organization, it gives you an advantage, because they protect you from, as I said, those heuristics, those shortcuts, mental shortcuts. The planning fallacy is a big one that shows up over and over, because we just have a tendency to overestimate our ability. And as much as it might be overestimating our ability, we probably also underestimate the power of advertisers and the power of VUCA, the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity that's around us all the time. Remember, there are advertisers and marketers who are working 12 hours a day to figure out how to get you to do something that you weren't even thinking about doing, something that's not even aligned with your vision or your purpose. And it works. Just look at how many people live paycheck to paycheck, and it's no matter how much money they make, they can still fall into that paycheck to paycheck, because the advertisers know how to tap in to those mental shortcuts, those heuristics. And it happens in business too. We've all been in a presentation where we're literally thinking we don't need this, and we're still moving towards buying. That's just a small example. The point is, using frameworks will help us to recognize when that's happening. So this framework here is just to get us started. I was actually in a conversation in 1980 about the acronym SMART, S-M-A-R-T, and I was in a room with a couple of guys. We were Success Motivation Institute distributors, and we were discussing how we could make this S-M-A-R-T into an acronym. And it started with just S-M-R-T. And then we added the A, and we couldn't agree. Should it be aggressive or should it be achievable? And, we sat through it. We all left that room in Waco, Texas, and went on and did our own thing and used it the way we wanted to. 15 years later, I see it showing up. Now, I don't know what that path was. It's very possible, as many things are, that we're a whole bunch of groups in rooms all over the world trying to come up with that same thing. What's interesting is, along the way, I've watched people trip over the aggressive versus achievable, the realistic versus aggressive. And what I like is relevant, and I like aggressive. I like both of them. And as far as the realistic or aggressive goes, I would say it has to do with context. So on this, what I have here in this line, we're going to call this the reality gap. This is time. So it starts over here with days. You could make it hours, but it starts over here with days, and over here we'll just call it a decade. The closer we are to the days, the more we need to be grounded in reality. As a matter of fact, if you're planning what you're going to do in the next hour, you know that you have to be dealing with reality. You're going to Google Maps or whatever you use to look at the traffic patterns. You're looking at your time. You're looking at what has to be done. If it's not grounded in reality, you're not going to achieve the target. This applies to days. It can apply to weeks. It can apply to months. It can apply to quarters. It can apply to years. It depends on the context. The point is, at this end of the time frame of days to decades, we want to have 100% grounding in reality. So this gap right here, a zero gap. We want to be 100% grounded in reality. As we move out into time, we can afford to be a little bit more aggressive because we can bring things in. We have networks, we have resources, we have resourcefulness, we have things that happen. If you've been in business any length of time and you've been on the creation side where your name is on the line, you've seen the serendipity. In corporate world, I used to say that I just need 80%. If I have 80% of the answer, I can go because the other 20% will come. And I lived by that. And I've had models and frameworks to support it. Once I got into business for myself, it was a global business, I shifted that to I have to move with 40%. Now that didn't just happen overnight. I went to 60, then I went to 40. You have to make that move with just 40%. There's so much unknown, there's so much, and you're still going to get stung potentially. So you still have to be able to pivot and adjust. Decisions are not good or bad in and of themselves. They're made so by what we do next. The point is, we need a plan to be able to take action, and that plan needs to be grounded in reality in the early stages. Now here, I would say that the SMART goal, S-M-A-R-T, the R could be realistic, but rather than change it up, we're just going to keep the R relevant. We're going to keep the A as aggressive, but at the lower end, we're going to tone down that aggressiveness. So on this end over here, we're going to use the problem-solving model. This is so often overlooked. I've watched leaders, smart leaders. I've watched smart leaders, very effective leaders, shortchange the first step of the problem-solving model, which is clearly define the problem, right? Einstein said if he had an hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes talking about it, defining it, and only 5 minutes on the solution. Now that doesn't scale, of course, but the point is we have to spend enough time clearly defining the problem. Otherwise, you create more problems along the way. Sometimes people get so enamored with the vision up here, and they feel like they already know the problem. This is a easy trap to fall into. They feel like they already know the problem, they know what to do. In fact, they already have the solution in mind. So they skip that step. They often skip the multiple solution step, which is the second step, come up with brainstorm for multiple solutions, or just come up with multiple solutions. And then it select the best solutions. There's other things involved. Deciding whether or not you need a short-term fix, and deciding how you're going to test it. Making the distinction, the 80-20 rule that says 20% of this project will take 80% of the time, or 20% of this innovation will take 80% of the time. Identifying that up front. Otherwise, the human nature is to go and look at it from a linear perspective and feel like halfway through we should be halfway through the task, when in reality, halfway through, you still have more than 80% to go because of the 80-20. And you can look at projects all the way back and recognize that the reason why projects often fall off the rails at the end is because we didn't take into consideration that last 20%, that's the gnarly part, and that's going to take 80% of the time. So on this end, we really need a grounding in reality. Then we have this phase here. I don't want to call it the grind phase, but this is the phase where, you know, is one foot in front of the other. You just got to keep working. You're maybe not seeing the results you want. You're pushing hard. It's taking a long time. You're seeing some flashes of brilliance. You're seeing some serendipity, but it's just taking a lot longer. This is where the typical SMART goal. Keep going after it. Use your KPIs. Have ways to look. And then it takes off. And this is why 10X is possible, because we underestimate what we can do in a decade. We tend to overestimate what we can do in a year. And that results in this 10 years that's really 1 year 10 times, because we keep starting and stopping. Looking at it from the good to great, whether it's the hedgehog concept or great by choice, specific, methodical, and consistent, or the flywheel back to good to great, the 20-mile march from great by choice, all of those are present in this approach, as well as the book multipliers versus diminishers. When your leaders are acting as multipliers, you're able to leverage and compound. And when you're up here, this is not grounded in reality. Your plans from here, when you're looking at your vision, it's not grounded in reality, because this up here is in the field of infinite possibility. If you've done this, you've probably experienced where, and I say serendipity. One of the reasons why we set goals is because it sets up the reticular activating system to be on the lookout for opportunities to advance that particular goal. And we see things that we would not have seen. A lot of people will call this, I manifested it. The thing was always there, or the opportunity was always there, but they weren't paying attention because they didn't have context, and the goal is the context. Purpose is the context. Vision provides context. But the reason I talk about it, this is infinite possibilities. If you've ever played Tetris, imagine being the game, not the player, but the game. Now, the player is against you, the game, and the player's flipping the blocks, and they're flipping the blocks, and each block is going down. And as the game, you're not making any, it doesn't look like you're making any progress. And the player's flipping the blocks, and they're just going down, they're going down. But as the game, I know that what I'm doing is I'm building a foundation. I'm building a foundation where things can't be seen. This is why you need the right type of KPIs, and you don't want to get too fancy with your KPIs in here, because this is the baby steps phase. This is the, like I said, you're going to have some flashes of brilliance, but the quantum leap phase is here, and it's in that last part. You might go 7 out of 10 years just grinding before it takes off. So I'm the game, and the blocks are flipping, and they're going down below the frame. Eventually I get a line, and then I get 2 lines. Now you're seeing some progress, but then those disappear. The player flips the block the right way, and they disappear. And you start it again. I get 4 lines now. I'm the game. I get 4 lines. Sooner or later, and if you played Tetris, you know where this point happens. The player doesn't stand a chance. They don't stand a chance because it gets to the point where there's so much momentum on this wall being built. That's how this looks and feels. But it takes some things. You got to have a vision. It helps if that vision is connected to purpose, and you need a plan. And you need to be realistic about that plan at the beginning stage, but you don't have to be realistic about the plan when it's out here in the infinite possibilities. But in order to do this, remember, we don't have an opponent like a sports team does. We have free reign. We have a free open field ahead of us. This is why you want to keep it simple. You want to have that flywheel concept where every week, every day, you're coming in and giving that flywheel a turn. So this is a framework that we'll be using and thinking in terms of where are we in this cycle? Are we here or are we here? And these could be projects within the bigger organization, the operating model. It could be changing the business model. It could be changing the operating model, or it could be just changing a process. That's what we'll talk about next week. Now, before I leave this page, I want to bring out something, because there can be 2 statements that are absolutely true, but they're misapplied. So one statement might be, right, it's like, don't be too aggressive on your plans. You want to make sure you're conservative. That might be true. In fact, that's what I'm saying here. I'm saying we have to be grounded in reality. On the other hand, you might have someone say, oh man, you got to shoot for the stars. You got to, hit for the fences. It doesn't make sense to play small. That's the wrong thing to do here, because you can have multiple false starts. I think it's how we end up sometimes with 10 years of experience 1 year at a time, where we really haven't moved the needle. However, when we're thinking about something that's 10 years out, we absolutely want to be aggressive with it and then build and have a plan so that we stay on course. And that's why I talk about vision and purpose and plan, because the vision without the purpose, you could get into a situation where it gets hard and it's not worth it. If you're just doing this for the money, or you're just doing it for the fame, there's other ways to get money and fame, and that will show up during the grind phase when you're grinding. So before I leave this diagram, I'm going to recreate it real quick and overlay something else that I'm seeing. So we have this idea where I'm saying that we want to be grounded early on, and then we have this middle period, and then it takes off. And this is not scientific, but I would say in this phase here, when you're making plans for days and then weeks, imagine if you're planning by the week and you constantly miss, and there's a lot of daylight between intention and outcome. You're not going to make very, very good progress, and you're not going to have a lot of confidence. On the other hand, if you are really tight with your intention and your outcomes on the short cycles, the days and the weeks, that's going to give you confidence to know that when things get tough, you'll be able to prevail. And we're going to call this the grounded stage. So it's the same thing I was talking about on the last chart, but I just want to leave this for you as a visual. So it's grounded, and we're going to be focusing on execution. This is where I'm talking about that very little daylight between intention and outcome. And then we have this next phase. And in this next phase, this is the leverage stage. This is widgets in, widgets out, one foot in front of the other. This is coming in and turning the flywheel, the 20-mile march. You're doing enough on the bad days, and you're not trying to overdo it on the good days. That 20-mile march concept is that every day you do the set amount. You don't go farther on the days that the weather's nice, and at the same time you don't slack off when the weather's bad. You put in those 20 miles every single day, and there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, we could go down a rabbit hole of why that's so important. But just think about this as the leverage stage, and what you're doing is taking advantage of synergy. When you set goals, the reticular activating system starts looking for opportunities to take advantage of, and synergy happens. And then this last one, the exponential stage. And in the exponential stage, it's all about that transformation. This is where the transformation happens, and we have to live into it. And it's sort of like surfing or riding a wave, because you may feel like it's too fast, it's scary, but by using the right kinds of KPIs along the way, so you're going to have KPIs that make sense here, you'll have KPIs that make sense here, and you'll have KPIs that make sense here. So I want to go down. I don't want to go too far into this, but I wanted us to have a common language as we talk about innovation, because just having this mental model and a way to talk about it, I've seen people, and they're just so unrealistic right here, and they're not willing to tone it down because it's worked for them in the past. They set bodacious goals and it worked, and that's in their mindset. I've said before that sometimes we create bad habits out of our successes, and that would be an example. Right, the last thing I'm going to share with you on this topic is, if you think about old style project plans, we called them waterfall, and now what we see is agile, and agile used to be user experience, iterative development. These are some of the terms that we hear. And I would say iterative is a fancy term for trial and error these days. And I don't want to make this about an agile project conversation. But if you think about a waterfall Gantt chart, we don't see these too much anymore, but when you're building roads, this is what you would use. You build a road, you have all these things that you do, and you lay them out, and then it's done, and you move on. When we started, the Agile showed up early 2000s because of the amount of technology projects that were coming on into play, and the waterfall approach just created too many problems. So we used to do user experience, and that was in the build part. But then Agile came as a methodology more to, I guess, to operationalize project work. But now what we're going to have is design. There are different ways you could look at waterfall, but for the simplicity, to keep it simple for this topic, we'll say design, and then build and develop. And again, this is where we do a lot of trial and error in business. Agile, there's labels and names for things that they do, and it's discipline. But for here, just think about this as trial and error, and this is implementation. And that includes testing and feedback and the rollout schedule, and then you have monitor and adjust. So I added this. You're not going to see this on a typical waterfall project, monitor and adjust. You might see follow-up, implement and follow-up. You might see change management. But if you think about building a road, once that road is built, there might be some steady state that goes into it, but you're not looking at it the way you would a technology development, where you have to keep looking, make sure it's working on the different platforms, it's working in different countries, etc. So there's much more monitor and adjust. So with this in mind, what I want to do is, and again, the audience here is small business owners. When we start talking about innovation, there are, say, 4 different zones. We're going to call this Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3, and Zone 4. There's a concept out there. It starts with space designers, and space designers are just what you would think. These are the entrepreneur types. They're able to come up with these ideas, and they're willing to bet the farm on it. They have this vision. It's like they're systems thinker, deeply curious. They thrive on the ambiguity. They love the challenge. They can hold risk without getting off track. Visionary, right? That's the space designer. And maybe a question that they use is, what's possible? Then the next one we have is space fillers. And you have probably experienced this in different ways. There are people who are great at designing and coming up with these great plans, but they just can't put it into action. They struggle with that, with making it work. There are tons of ideas, can't make them work. And this could be both. You could have space fillers who have the ideas, but they don't know how to get it started. You can have the space designers who have the ideas and don't know how to operationalize it. So you do need both. And the space fillers, these are problem solvers. They love having a scope so that they can problem solve within that. A space filler will often feel stuck if they don't have enough curbing to push them into a certain direction. They like the constraints, but they also like the freedom of action, and they're going to be looking for improvement. So if you think about that part of the curve where I was talking about, this leverage stage, it's going to make sense to have space fillers in this leverage stage. And these two this diagram and this one don't necessarily go together. They're independent. They can be exclusive, but they can also be used together where it makes sense. So space fillers, a good question they might be asking is, how do we make this work? How do we bring it to life? How do we make it better? How do we make 1 + 1 = 3? Those are the kinds of questions that you'll have from these space fillers. The reason I'm pointing this out is, as a business owner, you got where you are by wearing multiple hats. Some hats you wore better than others, but it didn't really hurt you because all the marbles were not on the line. You were moving and shaking. Things were moving so fast that speed was more important than perfection. And we don't want perfect to be the enemy of the good, but at the same time, we don't want to be so sloppy that we're costing ourselves money, costing ourselves time. Then this one is the space user. The space user loves to have everything tidied up. This is operational person. Just tell me what I need to do. Widgets in, widgets out. They don't get bored. They love the routine. They love the precision and the focus, and it keeps them grounded. Too much drama, and these people get knocked off course. These are the operators. I've heard them called steady eddies, and every organization needs them. In fact, these people are fine just moving along, and so this is more of a late stage. You can see how there are some similarities with the other diagram. And a question that they might have is, this delivering value? And if they can see that it's delivering value, they're fine. Just keep going on. As a business owner, you probably fit one of these categories. And depending on what category that is, it's worth looking at who in your organization can help fill those other two zones as you think about the project. Now, I should say, if you are building a jet airplane, this project plan could be 15 or 20 years. If you're building a new capability in your organization, it could be 2 years, 3 years in the making, if you include all the testing and the skunk works and all that. But sometimes if you're just looking at adding a new product or a new service, we could be talking 6 months. So it depends on the time frame. And then in zone 4, this one is Space Sentinel. Quick example, back in 2008 crisis, the collateralized debt obligations, you may recall that. The point is that they bundled these mortgages, and they bundled subprime mortgages with prime mortgages, and they created these derivatives that were toxic because they were working well when things went well, but the subprime would overpower the prime, and these things would just be worthless almost. And in 2007, they were still selling the collateralized debt obligations, so it looked fine from the surface, and investors were not necessarily looking at the signals. But what was going on is they were selling them farther and farther offshore. So you had less sophisticated investors, less sophisticated institutions buying these subprime derivatives further and further away from Wall Street. So there were a lot of signals, but it wasn't anything that said it's time to short, right? There were a few people who picked up on that. The reason I bring it up is that today, if you think about the changing world order and those graphs, I know one view is that it's not if it's going to happen, it's when it happens. It's kind of hard to turn around that kind of momentum, but I don't want to get into a debate about that. as certain as the upswing was, we have to consider that the downtrend might be a certain. The reason why you have to hedge is there's always going to be creativity happening to change things around. Anything can happen. But the Space Sentinel, this is like that guard. It's somebody who's paying attention to what's going on. They're risk aware, pattern sensitive, maybe alert to weak signals. They're grounded in reality but future focused. They're looking for what is that equivalent of the collateralized debt obligations being sold further and further offshore. It's like the canary in the coal mine, or perhaps it's the early indicators that institutional investors are using to know when to start getting out of a position. And so a question here, is this still the right solution? Environments are changing constantly. There are businesses who are adopting artificial intelligence solutions right now. They might be over relying on it, and they're realizing it's not all that it was cut out to be. You can look at technology going back into the 90s before the internet, and technology always sped things up, but things always stayed the same, right? It changes the velocity, but it doesn't change the game that much. So this zone 1, 2, 3, and 4 is something to be thinking about as you innovate. And this is where a board comes into play. If you're a small organization, you're going to have to do a lot of this with skunkworks, but you can think in terms of who in your organization can fill these roles. Maybe this is where you think about who you need as a coach, or where you need a consultant, or where you need to go to Upwork and hire somebody for 6 months to help you out. This is the kind of conversations we want to be having when it comes to innovation. We'll get into the business model versus operating model versus process, project leadership versus project management versus operations. And then the following week, we'll get into change management. Once I get through these first 3 segments, then we'll open up to have real conversations about changes that you're applying. So we have multiple presentations out there on dynamic leadership, multiple presentations on sales, multiple presentations on development plans, and then we'll have these in the innovation series, and we'll start applying this to real world things, because the best way to experience dynamic leadership is to experience it and see it happen in real time. And you recognize that this is not any rocket science thing. It's leading the way people want to be led, and it's leading in a way that works for organizations. So we'll see you next week. I'll set up the event earlier. We'll start at 8 o'clock on Fridays. And then, as I said, the 4th week out, which will be 3 weeks from now, we'll open up the Zoom that goes with it so that we can have interaction. And those will be free sessions. All right, see you then.